Well, good evening. We're doing sound. And welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I appreciate y'all coming out on a snowy night here in Springfield, Illinois. I'm Christina Shutt, the Executive Director of the ALPLM, and it's a very special night here. Not only do we get to celebrate Black History Month, which is one of my favorite months of the year, but it is the first in our new For the People Speaker Series. The goal of our For the People Speaker Series is to feature bold thinkers with unique insights into the people of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we certainly have that with our special guest tonight. But first, a couple of reminders. Please join us on Thursday, March 3rd at noon for our next Tales from the Vault. Lincoln historian Dr. Christian McWhorter will focus on the women of the Lincoln family and their impact on Lincoln's legacy in honor of Women's History Month. Later that night from 4 to 7 p.m., the museum will be open and free, with free admission for our Abe for All event in recognition of World Hearing Day. We'll have sign language interpreters throughout the galleries as well as for our theater shows, and we'll be using some special technology and really enhancing the visitor experience. So we hope you all will come out and encourage your neighbors who may be deaf or hard of hearing to join us that night. In addition to all of that, we'll be seeking input and feedback, again, about how to improve the museum experience. So it truly is a museum for all Illinoisans. Later in the month, we'll also feature our first History Happy Hour, and in early April, we'll welcome Edward Curtis, the fourth, to talk about his new book, Muslims in the Midwest, as our second installment in the For the People Speaker Series. Full details and registration for these events is available at presidentlincoln.illinois.gov. And without further ado, our guest tonight, Dr. Tamika Nunley, joined the faculty of Cornell University in the summer of 2021. Prior to Cornell, she spent 6 years as Associate Professor of American History at Oberlin College and Conservatory. Her research and teaching interests include slavery, gender, 19th century legal history, digital history, and the American Civil War. At Oberlin, she created the History Design Lab, which allows students the opportunity to develop scholarly projects that involve methodological approaches such as digital humanities, public history, creative nonfiction, and curatorial practices. She has published articles and reviews in the Journal of Southern History, the William and Mary Quarterly, the Journal of American Legal History, and the Journal of the Civil War Era. In addition to being a lifetime member of the Association of Black Women Historians, she serves on the editorial board of Civil War History and on committees for the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, the Society of Civil War Historians, and the Southern Historical Association. She is currently completing a second book, The Demands of Justice: Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia, 1705 to 1865, with the University of North Carolina Press. Tonight, we are going to learn more about the powerful story told in her first book, At the Threshold of Liberty: Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C. Please join me in giving a warm Springfield welcome to our inaugural For the People Speaker Series speaker tonight, Dr. Tamika Nunley.
Thank you all so much for coming out in the snow tonight. I hear people in Springfield don't like to come out in the snow when it gets too crazy, so I appreciate the audience tonight. I also just want to thank Executive Director Christina Shutt and also Joe Crane for being such wonderful hosts. It's been wonderful. I've had a chance to go through the exhibits and the library, and it's been a real treat. So today, I'm going to talk to you about African American women and the boundaries of freedom, and I like to talk about the boundaries, both the physical, geographical boundaries, but also thinking about the legal boundaries, the real barriers that they're facing on the ground. And with that, we're also going to hear sort of interesting aspects of Abraham Lincoln's presidency and sort of some of the choices and decisions that he was confronted with at that time. Abraham Lincoln came to the nation's capital with the hope of putting Southerners at ease with a promise to leave slavery intact where it existed, while also firmly opposing the expansion of the institution in newly acquired territories. The South found neither solace nor confidence in a Republican president and prepared for civil war. In 1862, Congress enacted legislation that authorized the compensated emancipation of enslaved people in the nation's capital. So this is the DC Emancipation Act of 1862. For Black Washington, the years of waiting for Congress to exercise such power ended at the beginning of the Civil War in spite of arguments against the constitutionality of local emancipation. With the exodus of a strong contingent of Democrats following Abraham Lincoln's election, the Republican-dominated legislative body passed the measure with votes at 29-13 in the Senate and 92-38 in the House. Although the bill passed by a significant margin, the opposing votes underscore an underlying truth about this era. Historically, white Americans expressed hostility toward the idea of Black liberty in both antebellum and wartime shifts towards emancipation. Scholars have pointed to rehearsals of gradual emancipations in the North and prevailing attitudes against racial equality. While many Americans embraced the prospect of ridding themselves of slavery, the manifestations of Black women's freedom-making in times of emancipation placed them at odds with dissenters who expressed concerns over equality, amalgamation, or the mixing of the races, and citizenship. This sentiment rang true for white locals in Civil War Washington. The landmark DC Emancipation Bill made provisions for compensation to slaveholders to the tune of $300, along with a financial incentive set at $100 for former slaves to relocate to another country. Still, even as some African Americans entertained the possibility of colonization, they decisively charted their course in the Union and remained in the capital. Accordingly, this marked the moment that white locals in Washington dreaded most. It might appear that the struggle for liberty ended with local emancipation, but Washington was the citadel of the Union, and what applied to those enslaved in the city in 1862 sent signals to enslaved people and slaveholders alike throughout the geographic region. For most of the country, slavery and the fugitive slave law prevailed, but slaveholders still felt threatened by what they saw happening in Washington. When Congress legally authorized the emancipation of a population of roughly 3,000 or so enslaved people, countless others took advantage of the measure. White Washingtonians braced themselves for a tidal wave of refugees. Black women, both refugees and recently freed, recognized an important opportunity. Throughout the course of the war, refugee women and freed women arrived in the nation's capital with intentions to be free and to define for themselves what life would look like. This was not a new pattern, however, since wars prior to the Civil War inspired flight and claims to liberty. Whereas the incentives for emancipation in previous conflicts emphasized leverage against foreign foes like the British, the legal measures deployed by Republicans were designed to undermine states in rebellion, although Confederate views of themselves as sovereign could mean that they too were foreign. As the war progressed, soldiers, officials, and legislators empowered by martial law and legislation helped usher in the process of emancipation. This constituted both a measure of strategic advantage and inconvenience, as they often managed more crowds of refugees than their camps could accommodate. The revolutionary legal transformations of the war marked Union lines, and the Capitol in particular, as key sites of power and significance. The perilous journey bondwomen and children made to these sites both inspired and tested the effectiveness of these policies. We learned from them the limits of government, the violence that comes with monumental societal shifts, and the idea of liberty as a powerful motivator for navigating such turbulent terrain. Charting the varied pathways that Black women pursued gives us a sense of the possibilities of their worlds. So on December 16, 1862, Emmeline Wedge filed petitions on behalf of herself, her 2 children, and her sister Alice Thomas, who were all enslaved on the property belonging to Alexander McCormick. McCormick refused to take advantage of the compensation provision of the new law the year it took effect in Washington, D.C., and Emmeline saw an opportunity. He reluctantly appeared before the clerk of the court after receipt of a summons. According to court records, McCormick, quote, denied the constitutionality of the Emancipation Act and said that he would bide his time until it was declared unconstitutional, end quote. Besides, he was a citizen with rights to property, and why would anyone take seriously claims made by an enslaved woman? Just before his case was decided, McCormick reappeared before the clerk and commissioners of the district, and for the first time, formally contended with the liberty claims of Emmeline Wedge. In this case, emancipation threatened the property rights of slaveholders and excluded white residents more generally from any democratic processes that decided the fate of slavery in Washington. Ideas about liberty and bondage were inextricably tied to place, and Washington was changing. African American women like Wedge assumed a new role not completely carved out for them, but with anticipation and even hope for what could be. Throughout the course of wartime emancipation, refugee women and freed women navigated the power dynamics that made liberty possible in order to secure it for themselves and their kin. Former bondwomen employed their knowledge of the geographic and political significance of Washington as they approached officials of the government to make claims to liberty. These experiences were distinctive in how they transformed their own futures, as well as the significance of the nation's capital as a site of liberty. For these women, liberty was the work of deciding the terms upon which they lived and they labored. Refugee women who arrived in the capital during the Civil War did so at their own risk, confronting a system in which their legal status was deeply ambiguous. Refugee and fugitive women took advantage of the geographic and political position of Washington, D.C., particularly in instances where they arrived from slaveholding states during or after 1862. And so here you see a map of D.C., and surrounding D.C. is Virginia and Maryland, and those are very different political circumstances for them to have to navigate. Many of them traveled to the district from Virginia, a bastion of the Confederacy, or Maryland, a loyal slaveholding state. According to the laws and customs of the Confederacy, Black women arriving from Virginia were considered fugitives, and depending on one's views, refugees. With Virginia in rebellion, officials might be less sympathetic to Virginia slaveholders, but an enslaved woman could never be sure. The intra-regional ties were strong, and locals with Southern sympathies likely undermined Black women's liberty claims if given the opportunity. Concerned with appeasing loyalists in Maryland, the federal government legally protected the interests of slaveholders in the state by upholding the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Depending on whether the laws of the Confederacy or the Union applied, Black women traveling from slaveholding states could be considered enslaved even as wartime emancipation took its course. Thus, Black women remained in a state of legal limbo as they navigated wartime policy created in the interests of states loyal to the Union and against the interests of those in the Confederacy. As emancipation unfolded, white locals resented the blatant absence of any democratic processes with regard to such significant matters and subsequently petitioned in protest. Slaveholders represented a small population in the district, but the loss of property value and the inability to claim the total value associated with enslaved people forced the government and President Lincoln into a position to decide whether to prioritize the claims of white slaveholders, the freedom of bond people, or strategic advantage in the war. Cheryl Harris arguably offers the most compelling interpretation of the correlation between property and whiteness. With regard to property, American law not only inscribed racial identity on property with the legality of African slavery, but as Harris demonstrates in her seminal work, whiteness developed into a specific form of property affirmed by the law. In the moment of wartime emancipation, Black women with the legal backing of the Union government disrupted this property interest in whiteness, even if momentarily diverting a centuries-long pattern of white expectations of power over Black Americans. But Lincoln understood that these measures were also about the shifting tides of war and the implications of wartime emancipation more broadly. Thus, the government demanded that white locals take the deal and prioritize the interests of the Union and its military policies regarding enslaved people. Although the bill offered compensation, white residents begrudgingly conceded to a Union government that violated a long-standing social contract with white men. Amid protests, as many as 966 slaveholders filed claims like this for compensation for enslaved people freed by the Emancipation Law. The clerk and board of commissioners, along with the secretary of the Treasury, were responsible for assessing the claims, determining the value of slaves, and transacting compensation. Commissioner records indicate that the majority of the claims involved smaller slave holdings ranging between 1 to 8 slaves. For the value of 4 slaves, which included an enslaved woman named Rosanna and her children William and Alexa Gordon and Caroline Lucas, an infamous brothel owner named Mary Ann Hall requested $3,000, and so this is her petition. According to Hall, Rosanna alone was valued at $1,200. White women appeared as frequently as men in seeking compensation for their property. A woman named Harriet White, for instance, requested a little over $6,800 for the value of 24 enslaved people. White's case was one of many filed by white women hoping to profit from the compensation provision of the law, revealing that both women and men were financially invested in slavery and believed they were entitled to compensation. Some locals possessed holdings as large, if not larger, than whites. District resident George Washington Young, for instance, boasted holdings of 68 enslaved people with an attested compensation value set at over $17,000. And I should add, these figures are not exaggerated because of the close of the global slave trade. The price of enslaved people was quite high during the antebellum decades. Slaveholders in Washington generally either took advantage of the compensation provision made for emancipation, or they questioned the constitutionality of the new legal measure altogether. White possession of black people as they understood the practice was permitted by the law and protected by the Fifth Amendment. Particularly for a state like Maryland, slaveholders felt entitled to protections for their property rights regardless of how events unfolded in the district. Compensation did not amount to the full value that an enslaved person might command in an antebellum market, and the provision could never replace the power to exercise full discretion over the decision to free them. Slaveholding and non-slaveholding whites feared that the hierarchies that shaped society were being undone by such measures, but this was an assumption that black women could only hope for. The geopolitical borders of the Chesapeake could either undermine or work in favor of black women's navigation of wartime transformations. The facts of Emmeline Wedge's case reveal the unique geographic position of Washington, D.C. and the neighboring Chesapeake counties as a distinctive geopolitical battleground over liberty during the Civil War. As an enslaved woman, Wedge challenged both the legal validity of her enslavement and forced McCormick to contend with her testimony against him. The Supplemental Act, passed in the summer of 1862, permitted enslaved women in the District of Columbia to testify against white men and women for the very first time. Regarding the actual case, evidence showed that McCormick's farm was located along the border dividing the district from Maryland, and that just one day after the Emancipation Act became law, he instructed the slaves to reside on the Maryland side of his property. According to the records of the Board of Commissioners, he built a small tenement for them on the Maryland side, while his main living quarters remained in the district, along with the cow pen and other buildings included on the homestead. While McCormick generally prohibited enslaved people from traveling to the district side of the property, it was proven that Alice was, quote, required to drive cattle from the pasture to the cow pen, end quote, which was located on the district side. Unidentified witnesses also testified that they had seen the women and children in McCormick's Washington home daily, and that for approximately 7 or 8 weeks, Emmeline and her family had resided in the district, with an older man also bearing the last name Wedge, who was identified as the father of Emmeline's husband. The Board of Commissioners ultimately acknowledged Emmeline's right to claim freedom under the Emancipation Act of 1862. Emmeline's case is illuminating because, among other things, Emmeline's husband and father-in-law did not file the petition on her behalf, but she instead took the initiative to make her own liberty claims. But this was not unusual. In her work on gender and the political dynamics of Reconstruction, historian Laura Edwards argues that, quote, African American and common white women formed a loud, visible, and vigorous public presence both during and after the Civil War, end quote. Patriarchy did not always feature prominently in Black women's quest for self-making or liberty. To the contrary, freed women in the moment of local emancipation filed numerous claims and complaints on behalf of themselves and members of their families, initiating the transition of entire families into liberty rather than wait on the authority of men to do so. Early understandings of citizenship rested largely on the imperatives of the patriarchal head of the household to uphold the rights and obligations of citizenship. Free Black men often made the argument that discrimination denied them the recognition necessary to fulfill their duties as heads of their households and as formal political citizens. Indeed, white women and free African Americans found ways to participate in associational and community-centered forms of citizenship in the absence of more formal privileges of citizenship, such as the vote. For refugee women, patriarchy at times proved inapplicable or irrelevant, and Black women found alternative expressions of their position in society or were not tied to any men at all. Nevertheless, patriarchy factored into outcomes in emancipation petitions depending on the commissioners and the bureau agents involved. Throughout the course of the war, Black women litigated, petitioned, and organized in the Capitol. The legal and extra-legal steps they took to realize liberty set in motion an array of claims to their lives and labors that challenged their racial and gendered exclusion. In many cases, officials from the Board of Commissioners, Union Military, and Freedmen's Bureau assisted enslaved women in their efforts to be free, to find kin or employment leads. White locals also deployed a variety of strategies to prevent Black women and men from realizing a life of freedom and equality. Former owners like McCormick attempted to evade new emancipation measures by claiming residence in loyal slaveholding states. Others employed violence or harassment to reinstate control over the lives of Black women. Slaveholding and non-slaveholding whites in the district and surrounding Chesapeake counties made it clear that they would not simply acquiesce to the terms of emancipation. In fact, the government still wavered on what the afterlife of emancipation might look like for refugees and existing Black residents. After the Emancipation Bill passed, Black residents either remained in the district or left for other cities, but the law also included provisions for a government-subsidized immigration initiative. A longtime proponent of colonization, President Lincoln met with a delegation of Black leaders during the summer of 1862 to discuss the possibility of encouraging Black people in the district to leave the country. He made a point to express the potential for Liberia, and especially Central America, as potential sites for relocation. Liberia, founded in 1822 by the American Colonization Society, Haiti and Cherokee, a region in New Granada, were among the places under consideration for Black settlements. Founded in 1816, the American Colonization Society held their first meeting in Washington and over the years led several initiatives for Black immigration to Liberia and Haiti. Moreover, Black proponents of immigration also entertained the possibility of colonizing specific locations in Central America as early as 1854. While immigration gained support for a minority of the free Black population, enthusiasts continued to fuel ongoing efforts to fund colonization. In fact, in 1864, 150 African Americans made plans to board a vessel headed to Haiti from Alexandria, Virginia. Discourses around immigration were certainly not new and did not inspire wholesale rejection from Black leaders. The delegation that met with Lincoln included Black leaders with established roots and residence in the Capitol, who founded the district's oldest Black churches and intellectual societies. Among them were John F. Cook, John Costin, Edward Thomas, Cornelius Clark, and Benjamin McCoy. These men descended from an established tradition of civic, intellectual, religious, and anti-slavery activism in Washington. They were not the Black men that would most likely be directly impacted by the emancipation measure, but they could be driven out by colonization. The Black leaders, however, possessed the influence to convince Black Americans in the district that immigration could encompass the beginnings of a promising new era of Black liberation. During the meeting, Lincoln remarked that without the presence of Black people, a civil war proved unnecessary. Careful not to overlook the obvious fact that people of African descent arrived in the country through brutal force, he also acknowledged that slavery was the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. He believed that Black people should live where they are, quote unquote, treated best, and argued that it was better for both races to be separated. Lincoln pleaded further, stating, quote, "You may believe you can live in Washington or elsewhere in the United States the remainder of your life, perhaps more so than you can in any foreign country, and hence you may come to the conclusion that you have nothing to do with the idea of going to a foreign country. This is, and I speak in no unkind sense, an extremely selfish view of the case," end quote. Lincoln tried to convince the delegation that the greatest service to Black people, particularly those new to freedom, involved relocation to a place free from white prejudice. This was an attempt to appeal to their leadership and influence among Black Washingtonians. He went further to explain the appeal of Cherokee, a place rich with natural coal deposits that Black people could extract to generate profit from exports. He also emphasized the strategic location of the colony and duly noted Central America's close proximity to the North American mainland as opposed to Liberia. With Lincoln's strong endorsement of the scheme, Congress appropriated $600,000 towards colonization. Black leaders such as Henry McNeill Turner, Joseph Williams, and Delegate Edward Thomas supported the idea and encouraged Black people to remain open to the possibility. Such support represented one of many expressions of Black desires for independence and self-determination. The majority of Black Washingtonians, however, remained hopeful that liberty on American soil might appear on the horizon. Wartime emancipation symbolized an important victory for Black Washingtonians, as well as white abolitionists, but it was clear that Congress and the President encouraged their exodus. Although such colonization efforts had gained some traction prior to the war, the government could not convince a critical mass to immigrate outside of the country after emancipation, nor could they convince white people to affirm the idea of Black equality and citizenship on American soil. African Americans articulated visions of birthright citizenship long before the outbreak of war, and refugee women and freed women asserted their right to remain in the district when emancipation took effect. They did not see themselves as citizens of a foreign land. Their labors, struggles, and loyalties had fostered a sense of belonging in North America. And I just want to kind of ad-lib a little bit off of this quote, because I think this quote can easily be taken out of context or kind of be read from a very presentist perspective. Obviously, the state of African Americans has changed from 1862, but colonization was a very serious venture. It was something that was taken very seriously by both African Americans and also by white Americans. And I think that this quote is really fascinating because if it stands alone, it could seem aggressively exclusive, but I don't think that that was how he was approaching it. I think Lincoln, by even having a delegation of African American leaders, was really contemplating what does it seriously look like, what is possible after this war is over for African Americans. And I think that he also knew what lied ahead, the kind of violence, the kind of repression that would lie ahead, that this transition to freedom was going to be a lot more complicated than a simple bill, right, being passed, right, enforcing the southern states to accept Black freedom. And so I try to tell my students when I'm teaching them, right, because they get frustrated with Lincoln when they read a quote like this, that actually we have to really kind of think about this, that Black folks and white folks were thinking seriously, is it viable for Black folks to live in a post-war America after emancipation? And you know, the next set of stories I'll tell you will show you what they're up against to just give you a taste of it. But it's a very interesting quote that I'd love to talk about in Q&A if you all are interested. Over a year since emancipation took effect, Black women continue to pursue freedom and carve out a life within the Union. The logistical challenges of realizing liberty, even towards the end of the Civil War, can be seen in the experiences of parents who wish to rescue children from slavery. In the absence of testimony from parents and guardians, orphans' courts enacted judgments that supported apprenticeship rather than full emancipation. The judges administered parental authority as parents searched for children, attempted to claim guardianship rights, or faced threats and intimidation from former owners. Although the labors of all household members were critical to the subsistence of families during the 19th century, local justices in the Orphans' Court often refused to acknowledge the rights of Black parents to protect the labor of their children. In many instances, slaveholders hoped to entice parents to remain on farms by withholding children. As a result, Black women sometimes took matters into their own hands in order to retrieve their children from the grips of planter exploitation and create a life where their families could enjoy the fruits of their own labors. Jane Camper, a former bondwoman, reportedly told her former owner, quote, "of my having become free and desired my master to give me my children and my bedclothes. He told me that I was free, but that my children should be bound to him," end quote. She testified further that, quote, "he locked my children up so that I could not find them. I afterwards got my children by stealth," end quote. Camper, like many other freed women, risked their lives to save their children by stealth from unconsented apprenticeship. She concluded her statement saying, quote, "my master pursued me to the boat to get possession of my children, but I hid them on the boat," end quote. As Camper's story reveals, the Union government made freedom of Black women and children lawful, but not always tangible. Liberty for freed women meant recognizing their legal guardianship over their children, a novel concept after years of chattel slavery. By the end of the war, children found themselves separated from loved ones and familiar surroundings and thrown into labor arrangements without the consent of parents. White locals, as well as agents, at times questioned the parenting abilities of Black mothers, which further complicated their efforts to claim their children. Catherine Green's children, James and Charlotte, worked on separate farms in Southeast Virginia. She requested that the Freedmen's Bureau write to the people that hired them to demonstrate that she possessed the legal authority to secure her children. Similarly, Susanna Johnson reached Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, John Eaton, in search of her 10-year-old daughter, Phyllis. In a letter to Betty Devon, Eaton stipulated that since Phyllis was not legally bound with the consent of her mother in a possible case of violence or resistance, that Susanna Johnson is authorized to call upon the nearest military authorities for assistance. So the government now realizes that we have this law applies to these folks, but enacting this law, enforcing it on the ground is actually going to require a whole nother level of federal intervention, and this is why the Freedmen's Bureau becomes instrumental in that effort. Just a few days later, Eaton sent another letter to Devon requesting the release of a 7-year-old boy named Jackson. Jackson's mother, Adeline, asked Eaton for assistance in securing her son from Devon's home. Women like Devon, however, did not relent so easily to the requests of the assistant commissioners. The following month, Eaton sent another letter with the same request stating that we deem it our duty to do all that we can legally to reunite families that were separated under the quote-unquote old system of slavery. The customs of the old system of slavery proved hard to break in the region. Even with assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau, the resistance of former slaveholders appeared regularly in correspondence. Patsy Berlin attempted to recover her mother along with her 4 sisters from a Mr. Garnett from near Fredericksburg, Virginia. Berlin noted that Garnett starved them and that, quote, "they are working for this Garnett, their former owner, without compensation," end quote. Eaton sent correspondence to Fredericksburg stating, "I would respectfully recommend that this statement as made by the colored woman be referred to the officer in charge of the district for the investigation for the correction of any abuses." So it required military intervention to get these children and these family members back. While the treatment of former slaveholders remained unchanged, the assistant commissioner's willingness to intervene and prioritize the testimony of Black women demonstrates that freed women initiated a transformation in the relationship between themselves and the government. In order for liberty to translate in the lives of freed women, they had to articulate their preferred terms of labor for themselves and their families and wield authorization given by officials like Eaton. They were engaged in both personal and political processes of self-making. The Black women who sent letters to Eaton applied gender norms in their appeals to the federal government. For them, liberty implied the obligations of the government to the citizens, and particularly those who subscribed to acceptable gender norms to secure that liberty. Black women entreated officials to intervene when the realities of their lives and their loved ones conflicted with the tenets of liberty and the entitlements of independent households. One woman, Mary, requested that Eaton write on her behalf as she retrieved her daughter, Mary Agnes, from Maryland. In the letter, he stipulated that, quote, she acts with the advice and consent of her husband, the father of the said Mary Agnes, and so has full authority to bring her daughter home. No person or persons will interfere with her lawful acts for this purpose, and any officers of the army she may be so situated as to aid her, end quote. Agnes called upon the hierarchies of patriarchy to reinforce her claims to her daughter, since Eaton made reference to the consent of her husband to authorize the retrieval. Furthermore, the presence of the military provided another motivation to enforce compliance with the order. Black women in the Capitol approached Eaton with the expectation of advocacy and endorsement in the event of disputes. Amelia Hanson contacted the Bureau to seek help retrieving her two sons, Charles and Israel. Should they resist her claims to her children, Eaton indicated that, quote, Amelia is authorized to call upon the nearest military authorities for assistance. In another case, Sophia Smith requested assistance with securing her children from a Mrs. Lucinda Dodson. Eaton wrote that Dodson stating that because you refused to allow them to come to her, that the said Sophia Smith is authorized to call upon the nearest military authority for assistance. Similarly, Mary Queen, the grandmother to 12-year-old Kitty, complained that Charles Mills refused to give the child up to her. Eaton made clear that he recognized Mary Queen as the rightful protector, as the father and mother of the child are both dead. Bureau and military officials functioned as federal liaisons in the transition to freedom as Black women called upon their authority to recover loved ones from the grips of bondage. The correspondence reminds us that not every orphan was truly an orphan. Even as children lost their parents, guardians, and kin appealed to the Bureau to intervene on their behalf. Black women not only attempted to seek the release of loved ones from planters that exploited the labors of kin, but they also sought the discharge of loved ones confined in jails and slave pens during the war. A release from prison and pens could take up to a year or two after the war ended. Dola Ann Jones petitioned on behalf of John Jones, Richard Coates, and Caleb Day, Black men who received convictions for aiding slaves in an escape that took place in 1863. Convicted the same year that President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery still prevailed in the Union, and free and enslaved Black people continued to disentangle themselves from the old legal regime. The refugees likely came from Union territory, perhaps Maryland or Delaware, since the police regularly housed fugitives in the city jail. Sentenced to 11 years in prison, Dola Ann Jones, kin to John Jones, hoped to appeal to the Bureau for their release. Well after states legally recognized emancipation, the convicted men already served 2 years when Jones submitted the inquiry in 1865. Eaton realized that these previous verdicts based upon the slave laws and Black codes posed a problem by the end of the war when slavery became illegal except in instances of criminal convictions. He pleaded that the governors of Maryland and Virginia to ensure that those confined for violation of the fugitive slave laws or any slave codes be granted a pardon. In the Capitol, he wrote to President Andrew Johnson requesting a pardon for a 13-year-old boy named Beverly McCall. McCall's mother, who, quote, appears like an industrious, intelligent colored woman of good character, worthy and competent to provide for her son, end quote, made Eaton aware of the 2-year sentence in the penitentiary. The court charged Beverly with theft. Eaton learned that the Union military brought him to the Capitol from nearby Fredericksburg. In his possession, Beverly held a breastpin valued at $40. Condemned and confined with quote-unquote hardened criminals, the mother pleaded for her son's release. Eaton informed the president that he believed Beverly's mother could, quote, train him to virtue and usefulness as a citizen, end quote. Young boys and girls and women and men who ran into legal trouble throughout the war not only found themselves in the city jails, but in the workhouses serving long sentences or slave pens as late as the winter of 1866. Black women in the region struggled to disentangle themselves and their kin from the racial oppression that slavery inspired well after emancipation. Even upon assuming freedom rights gained from the war, Black women continued the work of resituating their relationships between themselves, the government, and the communities in which they lived. Black activists organized a vigorous effort to respond to these changes. Without the assistance of local Black activists, and Black women in particular, Northern philanthropy and the intervention of the federal government, resources proved scarce in addressing poverty after emancipation. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner of Israel African Methodist Episcopal Church acknowledged, quote, "It is female assistance which has given impetus to all reforming enterprises and redeeming deeds," end quote. The mayor of Washington reportedly made no organized effort to address poverty in the city, and as a result, over 14 Black churches gathered crucial resources to accommodate the growing population of wartime refugees. African American institutions such as churches and relief societies organized by Black women generated the momentum necessary for raising funds and collecting material goods that refugees needed in Washington. Many of you might be familiar with one Black woman in particular who is featured in the White House in this very building, who appeared in the White House during the Civil War. Elizabethckley, born enslaved in Virginia, worked as a seamstress, a skill she learned from her mother and one that would help her secure freedom. The knowledge passed down through the generations to not only mend and stitch, but to create one-of-a-kind designs with beautiful fabrics and lace made Keckley one of the most sought-after Black women entrepreneurs of her time. Not only did she create stunning gowns for the wives of the political elites, such as Mary Todd Lincoln and Verena Davis, but she became a leading figure among African Americans in the city. During the Civil War, Keckley organized the Contraband Relief Association with Black women who attended 15th Street Presbyterian Church. She felt inspired to take action upon, quote, "seeing and hearing of the sufferings of the contrabands who are sent to Washington," and she subsequently proposed to some of her lady friends when returning from church the necessity of a Contraband Relief Association, end quote. Keckley explained, quote, "The Contraband Relief Association was formed for the purpose not only of relieving the wants of the destitute people, but also to sympathize with them and advise them," end quote. She made appeals to Black newspapers and explained, "We need for them food, clothing, and money. We have now several invalid families of women and children under our care, for whose house rent, fuel, and medical attendance we're obliged to expend money." Without the assistance of Northern benefactors and prominent women such as Mary Todd Lincoln, Keckley reported, quote, "We have visited and counseled them with the assistance. We have visited and counseled them, and we have, as far as we have the ability, relieved their wants by giving them food, clothing, and medicine." And so here I can't reiterate enough, right, the number of refugees that are coming to the nation's capital, knowing that Lincoln has passed the Emancipation Proclamation with the hopes of a new future. But what they find are very overcrowded and diseased conditions, right? And they are very desperate to be able to feed, clothe, and house themselves. By the end of the war, there were a number of societies devoted to the aid and relief of refugees and freed people, many specifically devoted to women and girls. The financial contributions of Northern philanthropists made transportation and admission into industrial schools and jobs possible for young Black girls recently freed after the war. Congress approved the incorporation of the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children, an organization that reflects the legacy of Keckley's Contraband Relief Association. According to a federal official, they emphasized the quote-unquote training of virtuous citizenship for many outcast children. The association focused on raising funds and providing basic necessities and instruction in moral improvement. Even as the government shut down federal agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau in 1872 and withdrew military support in former slaveholding states in the late 1870s, the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children continued operations well into the 20th century. By the late 19th century, during the nadir of anti-Black violence and repression, a vibrant social and political movement of Black women's activism had appeared at the forefront of the nation's capital. This activist tradition among Black women in the district originated with the claims that enslaved and free Black women made much earlier when the government established the nation's capital on the Potomac. The emphasis on the actions of Union authorities often obscures freed women's struggles to define the terms of their inclusion. The process of realizing and navigating liberty reflected a more collaborative than patronizing process. This doesn't mean that they didn't appeal to soldiers, federal authorities, or even call upon 19th century gender norms. They strategically navigated a changing government and society to help make legislation a reality for themselves. Black women challenged the notion that liberty stopped at legal emancipation. Using tactics such as flight and appeals and petitions to the government, Black women found kin, shelter, food, jobs, and support for survival. These were the strategies deployed to set up the foundations for establishing their own terms of liberty. The actions of enslaved women like Emmeline, refugees like Jane Camper, and free women such as Elizabethckley set in motion a dynamic that positioned Black women to confront white resistance and appropriate various channels of recourse recognized by the Union government. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, Tamika Nunley. Any questions for Tamika? Right over there. Go right ahead.
So the U.S. government provided the funding for the compensation to the slaveholders.
That's correct.
And there are records that show how much was paid out.
Mm-hmm.
And did they, in each former slave received $100, or did they have to bargain to get a certain amount for themselves to start over?
No, that's a great question. So they only received the $100 if they chose to leave the country.
Oh.
And so many, they all forfeited that $100. And for the compensation of enslaved people to slaveholders, the maximum amount was $300, which was nothing in the antebellum market, right? And so it was really not going to be an amount that really fully compensated them based off of the value that a slaveholder invested.
Per slave, 300, or for the total?
Just for DC residents, it's $300 for each enslaved person. But you know, a middle-aged, you know, enslaved woman, you know, could go for $600. A younger enslaved woman could go for $1,200. Right, and so it just depends. But $300 was certainly not a price that they were looking for.
Any other questions?
I would be curious to know more about what the freed African Americans thought about colonization in Liberia, because I've, you know, read about, you know, the white perspective, but not much about the African American one.
Well, there were African Americans earlier on in the 19th century who actually did go to colonize Liberia. But what's interesting is that the idea of colonization was proposed in such a way that it would be sort of an autonomous, self-sustaining colony, right, where Black people have the leadership over the colony. But it poses real issues, right? There's first the issue that you're going to colonize a place, which is never going to be easy, right? And it's always going to be rife with conflict, right? That's not land that they're entitled to. But then the second issue is that much of the American government was still trying to sort of oversee the governance, the general governance of the colony, right? And so it was just transplanting another form of what was happening in the United States into the western coast of Africa. So it wasn't sort of that level of autonomy that you sort of would have assumed, right, if that is being pitched towards you. And then the other issue with Washington, D.C. is that Washington, D.C., by the time of the American Civil War, has a very robust, strong community that has generations of roots that they can trace from residents in the district. And they've worked really hard to build schools, to fund their own schools, because their tax money was funding actually schools for white children, but we're not funding schools for Black children. And so they had to, you know, go the extra mile financially in order to finance their own institutions and churches. So they were vested, right? And they saw themselves as American citizens. And really early on in the 19th century, you see African Americans making claims to birthright citizenship before the Civil War. So by the time Lincoln has this sort of last-ditch effort, right, people sort of have it imprinted in their minds, like, yeah, that could be an option, but I'm pretty firmly rooted here. It's a great question.
Hi, thank you for coming and for this interesting talk. I'm interested in your methodology because it's so often so hard to find individual Black stories at all during the Civil War era, especially women. So I'm curious what kind of sources you used or how you creatively used your sources to kind of rescue these stories. I mean, Keckley excluded. She's easy to dig up things on, but how'd you find so many of these stories, and where'd you find these women?
It was really challenging when I first began to share that this was a project that I was taking on. Many folks who were experts on DC, just were saying, well, how are you going to do that, right? And quite honestly, I didn't know either. But I actually started in the kinds of records that are unattractive to start with. And so I started with the criminal court records. I started with police precinct records. And I found plenty of Black women in those records, not because they are deemed criminal in the sense that we understand it today, but because Black codes and slave codes had circumscribed their lives so much to the point that did not take much for them, right, to fall into the hands of the police and to the workhouse, right? And so, say for instance in DC, it was illegal for Black women to fly kites. It was illegal for them to play cards, right? It was illegal for them to assemble in groups larger than a certain number. They couldn't go out into the streets past 10 o'clock without a white person being able to vouch for why they were out, right? And so there's a whole nother set of laws that apply to them, which meant that if they're trying to live free and live life on their own terms, chances are there's going to be a good chance they're going to violate the law, right, and be subject to it. And so I started there, and then I began finding them in city directories. Then I found them hidden in plain sight, right? And so I was looking at the Dolly Madison papers and found that there was a little enslaved girl that she talked about all the time. And then there was another enslaved woman who that was really important to her, and that she sold a lot of enslaved people and families apart in order to finance her lifestyle. And so some sources were hidden in plain sight. It was just a matter of me kind of going back and saying, are there some enslaved people here? And then being able to find them. But I'd say the hardest records to dig up were records of African American girls who were going to school, who were free. Those records were at the Library of Congress, and I was able to find them there. And then these records that I shared with you tonight were incredibly hard to find because the Freedmen's Bureau microfilm is just endless. And so I just remember just looking at microfilm and just going like this for a really long time, for a few years, and being able to just extract some stories. And even as I'm telling you some of these stories, some of them I can tell in more depth, like Emmeline Wedge. Jane Camper, I can get a couple of lines. And then some folks, I can barely get anything, but I just try to make sure that they appear in the book. So yeah. So it was not intuitive, I would say. It was one of those things that I kind of made it really challenging for myself without having understood what the archival landscape looked like.
Any other questions right here? Go right ahead.
I just had a question. Do you have any copies of the book here with you?
I don't.
You don't?
Oh, and Joe and I talked about this, but I couldn't get them in time shipped to me. I'm sorry. But you can purchase the book on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, any indie store, and at UNC Press also, which they always have a sale too.
I'll bite on the Lincoln quote that you showed earlier. So since Eric Foner's book, Fiery Trial, a lot's been made of Lincoln's growth over time on race. Mm-hmm. So taking that quote, and then at the end of the war, Lincoln's talking about voting rights for Black men who fought. Do you see that as growth over time, or do you think he's always had this sort of idea of equality before the law, and he's just stuck in the politics of the possible? I'm trying to grapple with that.
I'll say that one of the things that I appreciate about Lincoln the most is his ability to surround himself with different ideas, right? And even people who would be unlikely interlocutors had he not invited them into it, right? And so that's why I make the point to say, there's a way in which you can read that quote and get really frustrated, right? But there's another way in which if you understand what the 19th century was, and to have have a delegation of Black leaders come and advise you on what Black people want, I think that's a very distinctive approach that is unprecedented, right, in the entire century, right? So maybe Grant is an exception, but I think Lincoln is actually more thoughtful about where he's getting his information from and really thinking about what is possible. I think that He believes in the potential integrity of the republic and sees this as a momentous occasion. And he does evolve in his thinking because of who his interlocutors are, right? And because he's not in his own head, he's actually surrounding himself with a lot of people who are sharing what they think. And then he takes that and then he makes decisions after that. And so I see him as evolving, and evolving because he's trying to figure out what is possible. I think he was discerning enough to understand the pulse of the nation and understand the pulse of the country, and even those who have seceded, especially those who have seceded. He knew that there were millions of African Americans who were going to be based in the South, right? And he knows Southerners, he knows them, and so that quote, I read it now more so as thinking about, in some ways, he was prophetic. He could anticipate what the 1890s was going to look like, right? He could anticipate what the South was going to look like, not maybe precisely, but he understood, right, that once you remove military forces, that the conviction of Southerners was so strong, and the way of Southern life was so embedded, for many centuries, that it was going to take moving heaven and earth to really get to a point where those millions of African Americans could experience full equality and citizenship. Yeah,
All right. Any other questions, folks?
these
All
are
right.
great questions.
Going once?
You sure? Yeah,
Way
go
over
ahead.
here. Yes.
In your tour of the museum, did you go in the White House kitchen display
did.
exhibit? And I assume you heard the voices there.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the relationship between the black people who worked at the White House and the larger community in DC? Were they any sort of conduit for information or ideas? Did they help organize or make suggestions?
Absolutely, yeah. And this is long before Lincoln's presidency, right? Lincoln's White House. Throughout the history of the nation's capital, when there are presidents there are going to be African Americans who are working in the White House, and those people are held in high esteem among African Americans in DC. They are seen as leaders of their community. And they are doing really important work. They're helping to start churches. They're helping to build schools. And so it's not this sort of how we portray their identities has to be on their terms, right? The White House is one aspect of their lives, but their lives are actually a lot more full and developed than that context. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's another question.
From that, you said in previous administrations there were always black people working. Were they slaves? Were some of them slaves that belonged to
Oh,
the
yes.
president?
Oh, yes. Yeah, many
Okay.
of them were enslaved. And Jefferson, right? Madison, I mean, little, most of them were enslaved, but some of them were free, or some of them were able to purchase their freedom after having served in the White House and hired out their labor. But it was not uncommon to have the labor of enslaved people integrated into the House. Many of those enslaved people were also brought from the plantations of presidents. And so they had preferred cooks, they had preferred ladies' maids, right, that they wanted to accompany them, and so they brought them there, which is also interesting. I tell this, and I talk about this in my book, particularly in the early years. It's these people are forced away from their families, number one, right, to work in the White House. So many of them, for the full term, sparingly see their children or their loved ones, right? But then they also forge ties with leading members of the community, in DC, and build connections that they leverage in the long run. And some even, actually are a part of plotted escapes from slavery, from the district as a result of it. So it's a very interesting journey that they have to endure.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, thank you to Tamika Nunley.